Welcome to this tutorial. So in this tutorial, I will talk about the fundamentals of programming using Python as a programming language. So let's just jump into the first section, which is about variables and data types. So I'll just show the first thing that I want to talk about, which is a comment in the Python programming language. So a comment in programming is quite common to see, and they can be written for many reasons. So you can write comments in your code to explain something, but it could also be to ignore something that you don't want to run in the code. And this will make more sense as you go on. But for now, just remember that to write a comment in Python, you have to start it with a hashtag like this. So this is a comment. And this means that when this code executes, this line will not be run. So the compiler will just ignore this line. And so let's just look at this statement. So this is called a print statement. And what it does is that it calls a function called print. And you need to, when you run a function, you need to run it with parentheses, right? So like this, and then inside of it, you would output, or you would define what you want to be output to the screen. So let's try to run this actually. So I will run this code now in VS Code. So let's just see what happens. So we see that it outputs hello world, which is nice. So let's just close this. So if I want to ignore this line of code, I can just add the hashtag in front of it, and then this will not execute. So if I try to run this again, we see that it only runs hello world once because this is the first line, and it doesn't run this one. So it only runs the first time. So how would you write a multi-line comment? That's also quite common, that usually you want to write it on more than one line. So you could do it like this. You could just print multiple, or you could just add a hashtag in front of every line. But that would be perhaps not that convenient. And there are better ways to write multi-line comments. So one would be to write it like this. So you can write a multi-line comment using 3 double quotes at the beginning and then 3 double quotes at the end. And this is a much neater way to write a multi-line comment. You could also use single quotes and achieve the same thing. So let's just, for the sake of clarity, run this, execute this file, and we should not see anything else than a hello world, right? Because that is what we printed in the beginning. So let's continue to look at another topic called variables. So what is a variable? So a variable in programming. So a variable in programming is called could be defined. So a variable in programming can be defined as a unique identifier to access a value stored in memory. So this is a mouthful of words, but what it means is that so many times when we write programs, we want the computer to store something in memory because we want to compute it later on, and we want to perhaps do something with that. So we can save some value to the memory of the computer, and then we can update this value throughout the execution of the program. And this is a very powerful thing in programming, and it allows you to create very dynamic programs. And so in Python, when we declare a variable, we don't have to do many things. So we just write the name of the variable, which is in this case, I call it name. And then you use this operator called the assignment operator. So this is the operator which you use to tell the computer that, yes, I want you to store Bob, this text, also known as a string. I want to save this to this variable, and then I can print it. So let's try to execute this and see what happens. So we see that it outprints Bob. So this is the most simple thing in when it comes to variables. A thing worth mentioning here is that in Python, we don't have to declare what type of data that we want to store, the data type for this variable. So we just say name. You just define the name of the variable. It could be age, could be anything right here, right? So this could be age as well. I will show examples of this later. But in other programming languages, such as C++, then when you define a variable or when you declare a variable, then you have to also define the type of this variable. So you say that it's an integer or it's a string and so on. But in Python, Python is kind of a forgiving language. So you don't have to define the data type, but the Python compiler will determine the data type upon assignment. And it's also valid in Python to change the variable to another data type. So it can be name. The name can be a string now, but it could be something else. It could be an integer later on. So let's look. This brings us naturally to the next topic, which is what are the data types, the basic data types in Python. So you have basic data types and you have more complex data types. But for now, we just want to focus on the basic data types. So we have 5 basic data types in Python. So the first is an integer, like 5. And the second one is float numbers, so like 5.0. And the third one is a complex number, like 2.3j. And this is, if you know math, if you know basic math, then you've probably come across the topic of complex numbers. I won't get into what this actually means. I won't go into the math of this, but just know that there is a type called complex number, and you can define what's called a real part and an imaginary part. And this is another topic to go into what complex numbers are in math. The fourth basic data type is a Boolean, which can be either true or false. And finally, we have string, like hello world. So let's look at the first type. So this is a variable. I call it my integer. And note the naming convention. I use this underscore, which is kind of the convention you would have in Python when you declare variables. This is called snake case, and you don't need to understand this now, but you should just know that this is the way we would write. So if you want the variable to be my integer, then you would the separator between the words should be an underscore. And I set this to be 5, so I used the assignment operator. I would say I assign this variable, my integer, to be of value 5. And this is an integer. So if I print this out, let me try to run this. I should get a 5, and you see that I got a 5 at the end, which is nice. Let's look at the second data type, which is the float. So this is it uses a floating number or a floating point. So we see 5.0. Let me print that out. Let's see what happens. Yeah, we get 5.0, which is nice. Let's continue to this other part. So this is what I mentioned before, the my complex number. So it's a complex number, and the j, I won't go into what this actually does. It's a way to represent numbers which can't be represented with real numbers. Basically, that's kind of the simplest explanation I can give about complex numbers. Let's look at Booleans. So Boolean is a quite interesting data type because it's used very often, and it's also used in programs to evaluate different logical expressions. And this is very common in programming, so you need to know what a Boolean is. So a Boolean is a simple basic data type which can only hold 2 possible values. It can either be true or false. So I mentioned this here above. It can be true or false. It can only be one of these 2 options, so it can't be anything else. So we would see it's binary in that sense, that it can only have true or false. And then finally you have strings, and this is a very common data type I would say in all programming languages. So this is a way to basically hold data. So it can be a username, it could be passwords, it could be anything, names, and so on. So this is a good thing to keep in mind. And a string data type is a single, or it's a sequence of characters. So it's you could also even say that it's an array of characters. So that's a good way to think of it, and this will make sense later on when we work with strings a bit more. And you should just know for now that you can store as many characters as is allowed in the system's available memory, and also you can use either single quotes or double quotes. So here I'm using double quotes, but you could also use single quotes. So that's good to know. So let's look at how we can assign values. I mentioned before assignments, and I mentioned the assignment operator. So let's look at how we can assign things in Python. So this is a bit more complex way to assign variables, but it's good to know that you can do this as well. So I say that x, y, z are 1, 2, 3. So this means that x will get the value 1, y will get the value 2, and z will get the value 3. And keep in mind that now I have a bunch of things that I also printed out. So we will print out the float and the complex number and the boolean and the string, and then we will print out these values. So let's look at this now. So we see that here I'm printing out a bunch of things, so you can just disregard all this above. These are the things I mentioned about the basic types. But what's important here is that, so I assigned these three variables to be of these three values. So x, y, z will be 1, 2, 3. This is a good syntax to keep in mind. Let's look at another way to use this type of assignment mechanism. So here I'm doing something different. So I'm actually swapping the values. I'm saying that, okay, x should now be the value of z, and y should still be y, and then z should be the value of x. So let's see what happens now. That's an interesting thing to look at. So now we see that 3, 2, 1. So it basically was swapped. So x should be 3. That's basically what we said. And y is the same, and then z should be what x was, right? So we kind of swapped them around. And this is another way to also assign variables. So, but this is what this means. You should read this from right to left. That's the easiest way. So you say that you assign 5 to z, and you also assign what z was to y, and you assign what y is to x. So all these should be now 5. So let's run this again, and we see that all these are now 5. Let's finish off with some of the naming rules for variables. So you have some rules for how you can name variables, and usually you could even use just a single character like this. That's a valid name, or a valid variable name. But at the same time, you usually would want to avoid just using a single letter as a variable name, because it doesn't explain what the variable is. And usually in programming, we want things to be as clear as possible in code. So we want to, if we know that we're storing a name here, we would want to, basically name it as name in this case. And some of the rules for naming in Python variables. The first rule is that a variable name has to start with a letter or the underscore character. So it can also be underscore. That would also be a valid name. But it can't start with a number, so you can't say 1. That would not be valid, and you see that even the compiler is yelling at me. And another rule is that a variable name can only contain alphabetic characters, so A to Z, or numerical characters, so 0 to 9, or underscores. So that these are the only valid characters in a variable. So you can't use an exclamation mark or a question sign like this. That would not work. And finally, you have to know that variable names are case sensitive. So name is not the same as name. So these are two totally different variables, even though they have the same letters, but the case is significant in Python, so you have to keep this in mind. Thanks for watching.